Welcome to the Working Wise podcast series of K&L Gates. My name is Amy Groff, and I'm a partner in the Harrisburg office of our firm's Labor, Employment, and Workplace Safety Practice Group. In this podcast, I'll highlight some of the issues and laws involving forced labor, child labor, human trafficking, and other human rights abuses in a company supply chain. And I'll talk about why multinational companies and even smaller businesses should be proactive in this area and should be thinking about these issues. There's now a growing awareness of what's known as modern-day slavery, which is the estimated 25 million people subject to forced labor or trafficking, and there's an increasing focus on corporate responsibility for combating these issues in supply chains. Last month, the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs released new child labor research and a new mobile app called Comply Chain that provides guidance to help companies prevent child labor and forced labor in connection with the goods they produce. These resources, as well as certain non-binding but widely supported international standards and guidance, are leading consumers and investors to increasingly expect companies to have processes in place and to be diligent when it comes to labor practices and human rights-related concerns in their supply chains. In terms of more concrete obligations, some large retailers not only expect but require their suppliers to meet certain standards as to diligence with respect to their downstream suppliers and certification of their products. Another trend is an increase in legislation that makes it harder for companies to turn a blind eye. One category is what I'll call transparency legislation. An example of this would be the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act that took effect in 2012. This law applies to retailers and manufacturers doing business in California with more than $100 million in gross annual revenue, and it requires that these companies disclose on their websites what, if anything, they're doing to prevent trafficking or forced labor in their supply chain. Another example is the UK Modern Slavery Act that was put in place in 2015. That law requires companies that do all or part of their business in the UK and that have more than 36 million pounds of annual revenue to disclose what steps they've taken to ensure that there's no slavery or trafficking in the company's business or in its supply chain, or if no steps have been taken, to state that. Beyond just reporting obligations, France enacted earlier this year a duty of vigilance law that will take effect in 2018, and this law goes farther and actually imposes an obligation on large French companies to establish vigilance plans and to identify and mitigate serious human rights violations in not only the company, but also in the company's suppliers and contractors. There has also been legislation involving supply chains introduced in other countries in Europe, as well as in Australia, for example. And this is a trend that we're seeing globally. In the U.S., for federal contractors, the federal acquisition regulations took effect in March of 2015, and they require government contractors and subcontractors that provide certain supplies acquired outside the U.S. or provide services outside the U.S. to implement a compliance plan and complete compliance certification for any contract exceeding $500,000. The compliance plan must be posted in the workplace and on the company website and must include procedures to monitor, detect, and terminate agent or subcontractor employees who engage in trafficking activities. Also in the U.S., the Tariff Act of 1930 was amended in 2016 by the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. The law prohibits importing goods made with forced labor and allows U.S. Customs and Border Control to block these shipments from entering the U.S. Previously, the prohibition on imports applied only if the merchandise at issue was available in the U.S. in sufficient quantities to meet U.S. consumptive demand. The 2016 amendment, however, removed this consumptive demand limitation, thereby expanding the reach of the law. So these are just a few examples of the types of laws that could come into play with respect to these issues. Some of the laws have penalty provisions or a potential for private litigation. Some of them don't and provide only for enforcement by the government or for injunctive relief. However, they all have a significant risk of negative publicity, and that's an important consideration when you consider the damage to your brand if the company is non-compliant with transparency or disclosure obligations, and even more so if the product or company is affiliated with forced labor or child labor or some type of trafficking downstream. So what to do? First, companies should identify and assess their risk, which can involve a number of factors, including, in particular, the relevant products and the region from which they're sourced. If a company hasn't done so already, it should actually map out the supply chain so that you know the companies and locations of companies beyond just the first or second tier suppliers, but that you understand, really every part of the supply chain. And you'll also want to consider the type of labor at issue. So whether it's a product that typically involves low-skill labor, migrant or seasonal work, if the use of recruiters is common, that can be a risk area, as well as whether the product market has a lot of price competition, just to list a few of the factors that may be pertinent. Once you've done that, you'll want to manage risk through a variety of measures, which can include looking at supplier codes of conduct, your corporate social responsibility statements, updating contracts with suppliers and other subcontractors, requiring subcontractor reporting, due diligence, auditing, providing training, making sure there are effective grievance mechanisms, and of course satisfying any disclosure obligations that might apply under the law. So for more information on these issues, I've really just scratched the surface in this podcast, but we will be having a webinar on October 24th, in which a number of my colleagues and I from a variety of different practice areas will discuss these issues involving global supply chains. And if you'd like to join us for that webinar, there's a registration link to the live webinar, or there will at some point be a link to view the recorded webinar after it has taken place. And that information is available on the K&L Gates Hub website, which is www.klgateshub.com. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that, and thank you for your participation today.